Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Pei Aleph. We're going to finish up the sugya we started yesterday. We're going to be involved a lot in the sugya we started yesterday, but specifically we have this one question that we're going to finish up now, which is why don't they get lashes for mechusar zman? Okay, what are we talking about? So if an animal is slaughtered when it's not the day it's supposed to be slaughtered, and in our case it's because it's otovet beno, and if you already slaughtered the mother, for example, then you can't slaughter the son on the same day or any of the offspring. So if you slaughter it, what did we say? Well, you're liable for otovet beno, but we didn't say you're liable because of mechusar zman, and you took a korban that wasn't supposed to be slaughtered and you slaughtered it on a day it's not supposed to be slaughtered. So wouldn't that be a prohibition? To which the Gemara answered. First answer was, well, we could just say very simply that the Tana of our mission just wasn't interested in that. But of course you would get lashes for that, right? And we saw where did the lashes come from? The pasuk v'shur v'ses sarua v'kalut leneder lo yeratzeh. This will not be accepted as a korban. We viewed that as a lo taseh, even though it was talking about blemished animals. We said the extra word shur v'seh was saying it's actually talking about even any animal that's not supposed to go on the altar, even if it's, let's say, not today, but tomorrow it can. There's a negative prohibition, and the Mishnah just wasn't interested in that one. And then we said, what about? But the Mishnah mentioned all sorts of other things like shchutei chutz, for example, but that was in cases when they don't get lashes for otovet beno. But in any case, you get lashes for otovet beno. They didn't mention any other possible lashes but theoretically you would get lashes on that. The second answer, which we just really started yesterday, was the very last words of Pei Amud, which is Rabbi Zera Amar Hanach lemechusar zman dakatuv nitko laaseh. Rabbi Zera said a mechusar zman is a unique case where it's not a regular lo taseh, but the Torah, now here it's a bit of a strange usage of nitak laseh. Often nitak laseh means that there's a negative prohibition, but there's also a positive commandment, like don't steal, but return, if you stole, return the lost item, and there's a way to kind of correct it. So there's a lav, and then there's an aseh next to it that kind of fixes it, and then you don't get lashes for things like that. But this time, they're using it seemingly in a different context. And again, there's difference of opinion among the commentaries how exactly to explain this. But we'll read on and we'll see what the Gemara does, and then we'll explain it. My time, but what's the reason that nitko laaseh? What it seems to mean here is the Torah took it out of being a negative and really learned it from a positive. Okay? And what they're talking about here is any mechusar zman. Now, the classic, what they're going to do is they're going to bring the verse, which is the classic case of mechusar zman. Okay, it's not the pasuk we just read, where from there we learned that if the animal is not supposed to go on the altar today, you shouldn't offer it. But we're going to take it from the classic case of mechusar zman, which is the first 7 days of an animal's life. We saw this pasuk yesterday. My time ad amar kra miyom ashmini v'hala yeratzeh. So what do you see from that pasuk? Okay, the pasuk says shor kesef oez. You have an animal ki valed when it's born. The first 7 days it should be under its mother. And from the 8th day then it can be accepted as a korban. Notice there's no negative prohibition here not to slaughter it in the first 7 days. So what do they say? It says, from the 8th day you can slaughter it. Now, so it sounds like only from the 8th day. Mi'ikara lo, from the beginning, right, in the first 7 days you can't. That's your classic mechusar zman. And notice in the pasuk, it's a lav haba michlal aseh, right? This is a negative prohibition that is derived from a positive commandment. The positive commandment is slaughter it on the 8th day. But it's obvious from the pasuk that you cannot slaughter it on the first 7 days. So a lav haba michlal aseh is an aseh. We've learned this many times, that if you derive a negative prohibition from a positive wording in the Torah, it's transgressing a positive commandment. It's not, and you don't get lashes for that. You only get lashes for a negative prohibition. So comes Rabbi Zera and says the whole issue of bringing a korban not in its right day, when it's not valid today, but could be tomorrow or in 5 or 8 days, that is a mitzvah aseh. You're not fulfilling a mitzvah aseh by bringing it in its proper time, but you don't get lashes for that. So he says there is no lashes for our case of mechusar zman, where you took an animal that wasn't supposed to be slaughtered today in the temple because you already slaughtered its mother. So today it's not its day, and you slaughtered it anyway, so you're going to be liable because of otovet beno, but you're not going to be liable lashes for bringing it in the wrong time because that's not a mitzvah lo taseh. So that's his explanation. But now they say, wait a minute, you're darshaning it from that pasuk. That pasuk, the Yom HaShmini B'Hala, you're saying means, oh, from the eighth day, yes, not from before, and you're darshaning a lava ban bichlal say from there, but a negative prohibition that's derived from a positive. But we need that pasuk to darshan something else. Rabbi Abdoliki, for what Rabbi Abdoliki derives. To Rabbi Abdoliki Rami, he brought a contradiction. Ktiv hayashivat yamim tachad imo. Halayla chaze. Says it has to be 7 days under its mother, which seems to infer that at night it's fine, because what does it say? 7 days this is under its mother, which means as soon as the 7 days are up, which when does that happen? At the night of the 8th, right? That night. But then it says, Uktiv on the 8th day, specifically day, not night, it can be brought as a korban. So, sounds like from the day. Here they're taking the pasuk not in terms of 8, they're saying daytime versus nighttime. Now, this pasuk leads to two completely contradictory things. One says it's already can be brought as a sacrifice at night. One says it can only be brought as a sacrifice during the day. So, haketzad, how does this work? Laila likdusha, yom lahartza'ah. At night, you can already sanctify the animal. And Rashi points out there's a prohibition to sanctify an animal that's not in its time to be sanctified, okay? If it can't be sanctified that day, if it can't be brought as a korban that day, you can't sanctify it. You can't say, I'm bringing this as a korban and designate it for a sacrifice. So if you take an animal within the first 7 days and say, I'm making this a sacrifice, that's a problem. But if you do it on the night of the 8th, you're good. But it can't be brought as a korban. First of all, korbanot anyway aren't brought until the day, so it can't be brought as a korban until the morning. Okay, but you can sanctify it the night before. And that's what we do with that pasuk. So now, how can we derive from this pasuk this negative, don't bring it on the first 7 days, and that it's only a status of a mitzvah aseh, right? Not keeping a positive commandment. Well, tivkra achrina. Okay, so we have another pasuk. And in fact, there's two psukim that talk about this 8 days. Okay, they interestingly only quote the beginning of the pasuk, which has nothing to do with it. I mean, it does, it's the intro, but it doesn't say anything about it. But we'll read the whole pasuk. Okay, this is in Shemot. We were in Vayikra Kaf Bet. This is actually in Shemot Kaf Bet, same chapter, but different book. Kain ta'aseh l'shorcha litzoncha. This is what you should do for your shore and your tzon, right? Your ox and your sheep. Shiv'at yamim yiyeh mimo. For 7 days it will be with its mother. Bayom hashmini titno li. And on the 8th day, give to me. So that's the pasuk where you can derive 8 days, yes. But before the 8th day, you're not allowed to. And that would be the lav haban bichlal aseh, which would have the status of not keeping a mitzvah aseh, which is why you're not going to get lashes. Okay. So that finishes that section. And now we're moving back to this concept of Rabbi Shimon about shechita she'ena reuya she'ena shema shechita. Okay, din and daf should go up later today on this topic of this shechita of Rabbi Shimon, shechita she'ena reuya, right? A shechita that's not a valid shechita isn't shechita. So today we're really going to delve in and try to understand. Now, if you remember yesterday, we had this, right? Then the first two, we had 3 cases where they said, this doesn't match Rabbi Shimon, this doesn't match Rabbi Shimon, that doesn't match Rabbi Shimon. And the first 2 were pretty intuitive, right? He doesn't think that, right? He thinks that if you slaughter an animal in the temple, right? It's not, okay? It's not considered. I mean, the truth is all of them were a little bit hard to explain, but it was all based on this idea that if you slaughter an animal in the temple, since the slaughtering of the animal doesn't permit the meat to be eaten until you actually sprinkle the blood, the slaughtering itself is not considered a proper shechita, in which case there's no otov beno. Because if it's not shechita, the prohibition is don't slaughter them both in the same day. Well, if you didn't slaughter the first one, then the second one is not forbidden at all. Okay, so you can then go ahead and slaughter the second one without any prohibition. And that's why we said our Mishnah clearly doesn't match Rabbi Shimon. And comes Rav Hamnuna on that same tone, says, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Omer haya Rabbi Shimon, ein oto ve'beno nohei kodashim. Okay, sounds like he says very simply, oto ve'beno is not relevant at all in the world of kodashim, which again, as we said yesterday, based on that, they could have questioned Rabbi Shimon and said the Mishnah obviously doesn't match Rabbi Shimon because it says Otov beno is noheg b'mukdashim. That would have been a simpler way to say this clearly doesn't go like Rabbi Shimon because he doesn't think that there's Otov beno by kodashim. That's how we're understanding this now. Okay, we're going to understand it a little bit differently by the end. So my time, what's the reason for Rav Hamnuna? The way he understands Rabbi Shimon? Kevanda, Amar Rabbi Shimon, shechita she'ena reuya, lo shema shechita, because he thinks that a shechita, if it's not a valid shechita, which basically means doesn't permit the animal to be eaten, which we're going to see in the next Mishnah later today. Okay, shechitat kodashim. In other words, he says it in a case, let's say you slaughter an animal for avodah zarah. So that's not a shechita, right? That's reuya, because you can't eat the animal. It's forbidden because it's idol worship. Okay, so that would be the classic shechita she'ena reuya. But the same thing is going to say with shechita kodashim is nami shechita she'ena reuya. Why is shechita she'ena reuya? Because of what we explained. Since you're not going, that the slaughtering doesn't permit the animal to be eaten. Something else does. Now, it's a bit weird that he says this, because in the end, it's true the slaughtering doesn't do it, but the slaughtering with the sprinkling of the blood does permit the animal. It's not like a shechita for avodah zarah, which you'll never be able to eat the animal. In this case, you actually will be able to eat the animal. It's just that it's not from the shechita alone. It's from also the sprinkling of the blood. But it is from the shechita. And that's what makes his opinion a little bit strange. And don't worry, because after today, we're going to understand it a little bit differently. So Mativ Rava. Rava is going to come and bring a contradiction. Okay? He's going to say, now this is going to take us a while to understand, because he's going to bring a braita. Okay, let's start with it, and then we'll see where he's going. Oto beno, kodashim bachutz. Okay, so here we go back to all these possible cases. So now we're in the case where you have a case of oto beno. They're both kodashim, and they're both slaughtered outside. Rabbi Shimon omer, sheni belo ta'aseh. Rabbi Shimon says the second one is a okay, the first one, kodashim bachutz, it's karet and malko, because you slaughtered it outside the temple. The second one, he says, is below ta'aseh. You have a negative prohibition of shchutei chutz without karet. Shaya Rabbi Shimon omer, kol ha'ra'oi lavo la'achar zman, harei hu below ta'aseh ve'ein bo karet. He says anything that could potentially have been brought later, it has a negative prohibition. Okay, now let's explain what this means. If it's mechusar zman, because it can't be brought today because it's a tovet beno. Okay, forget about what you know about Rabbi Shimon. Okay, put that aside because he doesn't even think it's otovet beno, what we thought. But right now it sounds like he's saying it does come under otovet beno. So if it could be brought later, okay, just not today, like this animal, which the second animal can't be brought today because it's otovet beno. If it could be brought tomorrow and you slaughter it today, but outside the temple, now you won't get karet for shchutei chutz, because today, remember what we said earlier about this? We said the second one is definitely not shchutei chutz because it couldn't even be brought inside today. So if you bring it outside, you're not going to be liable for shchutei chutz. Comes Rabbi Shimon and says, no. If you can't bring it today, but you could theoretically bring this sacrifice tomorrow, and today you sacrifice it outside, you're going to have transgressed a negative prohibition of shchutei chutz. You just aren't going to get karet. So this is like an in-between. We had before, right? When it's the first one, you're going to get karet and malko. When it's the second one and it's prohibited, mishum otovet beno, in our Mishnah we said, you're not even going to be liable for shchutei chutz at all. Okay? He says, no, there's a lo ta'aseh, you've transgressed shchutei chutz, you're just not going to get karet. Okay. Now, chachamim omrim, kol she'en bo karet, eino below ta'aseh. The rabbis say if it doesn't have karet, then there's no negative prohibition. In other words, it's either all or nothing. Okay? There's none of this in between. Okay? He says it's all or nothing. I'm just checking one quick thing here. I want to just make sure one thing. Right. When he says over here below ta'aseh, I just wanted to make sure, you get lashes. Okay? So you're going to get lashes, just not karet for shchutei chutz, and the rabbis say you're not getting lashes at all. The rabbis match exactly what we saw in our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon is in opposing position. But this makes no sense according to Rabbi Shimon, according to what Rav Hamnuna said. What did Rav Hamnuna say? There is no isur otovet beno. If you slaughter that second one outside, according to Rabbi Shimon, what should it be? V'kashelan. This makes no sense. Kodashim bachutz sheni below ta'aseh. What are you talking about? Kama miktal katal. According to what we said, the first animal was basically like killed. It wasn't really slaughtered because it's a shechita she'ena reuya, according to, right? The first animal was slaughtered inside. So theoretically, it's a good shechita. But according to Rabbi Shimon, he defines that as a shechita she'ena reuya. Because what does he say? Because this animal, right, by slaughtering it in the temple, you still need to sprinkle the blood, so the shechita didn't permit it for eating. It's not called a shechita. In which case, sheni mikabel bifnimhu. The second one is completely, it's not a mechusar zman today. It's not one of these cases where it can't be brought today. It can be brought today. It's ready to be brought today. If you now take something that's ready to be brought today and you slaughter it outside, which is what you did here, karet nami lichayev. In this case, Rabbi Shimon should say you get karet. So this completely doesn't match what we saw of Rabbi Shimon, because in very simple terms, this line of Rabbi Shimon seems to indicate that there's otova et beno and kodashim. Okay, that's the main problem, because he calls this a case of, well, it can't be brought today, but it can be brought tomorrow. That would make it otova et beno, but we said he doesn't hold otova et beno at all in kodashim. So that's our problem. V'amar Rava v'amar lakti. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to bring a braita and try to explain the previous braita based on this braita. Okay? And then we're going to go back and we're going to have to re-explain Rav Hamnuna. So Amar Rava v'amar lakti. So either Rava says this or some other person says this. This is how you should read this braita to make it make sense. And kodashim shnehem bach. Okay, so now we're going to have, there's three cases going on here. Okay, if you remember, we started in the braita, kodashim bachutz, and then we ended with this case where the sheni below taseh. What we're going to do is we're going to say kodashim bachutz is one case. The sheni below taseh is case number 3, and there's another case in between, basically. So we're going to split the words kodashim bachutz, sheni below taseh. That's not true. We're going to stretch this into 3 different cases. So the first is kodashim bachutz. Hachi kodashim shnehem bachutz. If both were done outside, l'rabanan rishon anush karet. So according to the rabbis, the first one will get karet because it was shchutei chutz. And obviously, what happens then, according to the rabbis, kicks in otov et beno. The second one, okay, pasul, because of otov et beno, it's disqualified. You can't slaughter it. And it's patur from shchutei chutz, though, because it can't be slaughtered today in the temple. When you slaughter it outside, it's not actually shchutei chutz, right? You're exempt. Milav de shchutei chutz. You're exempt from the lav of shchutei chutz. Le Rabbi Shimon shnehem anushim karet. Now that answers Rava's question. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's no otov et beno here. Both are going to get karet. Okay, the first one because it was slaughtered outside. The second one because it was slaughtered outside, and both could have been brought today because in this case, no matter how we're going to understand Rabbi Shimon ultimately, the first one is shchutei chutz. It was a sacrifice that was supposed to be brought inside. It was brought outside. That's definitely a shechita she'ena reuya. And the second one, because the first one is not a shechita, and according to Rabbi Shimon, there's no otov et beno, the second one was also brought outside, completely not proper shechita. It could have been brought in today because there was no otov et beno. So both are going to get karet. Second case, echad bachutz ve'echad bifnim. The first one was done outside. This is also, as soon as you do it outside, you're going to preclude no matter what, according to Rabbi Shimon, no matter what, it's a shechita she'ena reuya, okay? For sure, because it was supposed to be done outside, it was inside, it was done outside. So, echad bachutz ve'echad bifnim, l'rabanan, rishon anush karet. Okay, according to the rabbis, the first one gets karet, shchutei chutz. Sheni pasulu patur. The second one, though, was brought inside. Now, the second one is disqualified because of otov et beno. But it's exempt from shchutei chutz because there is no problem with shchutei chutz because you didn't slaughter it outside, you slaughtered it inside. Okay, but it's obviously disqualified because it's otov et beno and you weren't allowed to slaughter it. Le Rabbi Shimon sheni kasher. According to Rabbi Shimon, the second one is perfectly good because the first one was a bad shechita, so that wasn't anything. It's not called lishchot. So you're not having slaughtered both animals both in the same day because that one wasn't a slaughter. The second one, you slaughtered inside. It was perfectly valid. And now we're going to finally find the third case, which again, let's just go back. What did Rabbi Shimon say in the Braita? Sheni below taseh. Now we're going to have a case where the second one is below taseh, and you're going to see in a minute why. Echad bifnim ve'echad bachutz. If one was done inside and one was done outside, l'rabanan rishon kasher. The first one's totally fine. Upatur. Everything's good about it because it was a sacrifice you were supposed to bring inside, and you did it inside. Sheni pasul upatul. The second one is disqualified because of otov beno. We're in the rabbi's position. You already slaughtered the mother. Now you can't slaughter the offspring, and you slaughtered it, but you also slaughtered it outside. Now, since today it wasn't allowed in the temple, so you're patur from shechita because that's the general opinion of the rabbis. But now we get to Rabbi Shimon. In this case, Rabbi Shimon sheni below taseh. In this case, the second one is a negative prohibition of shechita because it could have been brought today in the temple. Sorry, it couldn't have been brought today in the temple because of otov beno. Now here's the problem, because he doesn't hold otov beno. But the way we're going to read the Braita is like this. The first one was done completely fine. So that's going to be a shechita reuya, even according to Rabbi Shimon. Okay? It was a korban that was done inside. That makes the second one otov beno. But now go back to that first line of the Braita. It said in the Braita, Kol ha'ra'oi lavo la'achar zman, since this animal can't be brought in the temple today, but it could be brought tomorrow because of the issue of otov beno, then it's below ta'aseh ve'en bo karet. You have this middle position. Since it can't be brought today, but it can be brought tomorrow, right? If it can never be brought, then there won't be shechita. Let's say it's a blemished animal, and you designate it for a korban, and now you slaughtered it outside. Okay, obviously you're not liable shechita. Since this one could have been brought tomorrow, but you slaughtered it today outside the temple, according to Rabbi Shimon, you're going to get a lo ta'aseh. But we still don't have, this doesn't make any sense according to Rabbi Shimon, because according to the way Rav Hamnuna said it and the way we said it yesterday, because isal kadatach ein otov beno noheg bekodashim, sheni amay below ta'aseh v'tulo, karet nami lichayev. But this still makes no sense. Okay, we made the Braita to make a little bit more sense, but it doesn't make sense in light of what we know of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon says there is no otov beno, and this is obviously based on the principle that there's otov beno here in sacrifices. So Ella Amar Rava. Rava now has to come up with a new explanation, and he says the following: Hachika Amar Rav Hamnuna. This is what Rav Hamnuna said: Ein malkot otov beno nohei bekodashim. There's no malkot for otov beno and kodashim. He didn't say there's no otov beno and kodashim. No, there's no lashes for otov beno and kodashim, which means that you could have a case of otov beno. You're just not going to get lashes for it. Okay, let's explain. Kevan de kama de lo zarik dam lo mishtere. Okay, so actually I'll explain it a little bit before we read on. But what he's going to say is like this. In the end, what was bothering us about the shechita of Rabbi Shimon? To say that the first slaughter is a shechita she'ena reuya is very difficult, because even though the shechita doesn't permit the meat to be eaten immediately, if you do shechita and then you do zrikat dam, that permits the meat in the end. And it's from the shechita that the meat is permitting, because if you didn't do shechita and you killed the animal and sprinkled the blood, you wouldn't be able to eat the meat. So in the end, what he's going to say is like this. You could have the prohibition of otov beno kick in. You just won't ever get lashes for it. Meaning, how will it kick in? If the first animal is slaughtered, like case number 3, inside. If the first animal is slaughtered outside, 100% that's shechita she'ena reuya. But if the first animal is slaughtered inside, and then after you slaughter the first animal inside, it's a valid animal. Kicks in, it's a valid shechita because you've slaughtered it and you sprinkle the blood. You'd have to do both for this to kick in. But if you slaughter the animal, sprinkle the blood, and the animal is now permitted to eat, so that ends up being a shechita reuya. That means that on that same day, you can't slaughter its offspring. However, if you do, now what do we see in the Mishnah? If you slaughter the second one, you're going to get lashes for otov beno. Comes Rabbi Shimon and says, you're not going to get lashes. Ein malkinotum. Okay, so what's he going to say? Kevan de kama de lo zarik dam lo mishtere basal. Here's a different problem. Because when you slaughter that second animal, otov beno, you didn't yet sprinkle the blood, right? What makes a valid shechita according to Rabbi Shimon? Only in the case of a sacrifice, only when you slaughter and sprinkle the blood, because until then, it's not permitted to eat. So that means when somebody comes and warns you and says, do you know that if you do this, you're doing prohibition of otov beno, you're going to get lashes. That's called a hatra'at safek. Why is it a hatra'at safek? It's not clear whether I'm actually going to transgress this or not. Usually when you warn somebody You have to say, do you know if you murder this person, you're going to get killed? And then you say, yeah, and I don't care. And you go and murder them. Okay, you did it immediately after the warning. But if the prohibition won't kick in until later, you can say like this, when I was warned, okay, do you know if you slaughter this animal, you're going to transgress otovet beno. Now, since I won't actually be liable until I sprinkle the blood, then the act of the shechita is not going to actually make me um, obligated. Only when I also sprinkle the blood. I could sprinkle the blood 10 minutes later and say, oh, I was planning to slaughter the animal, I wasn't planning to sprinkle the blood. In which case I knew I was going to avoid the penalty. And then later, the punishment. And then later I sprinkle the blood. I say, oh, I forgot that you warned me, right? The warning has to be right up against when you do the action. And the blood is not going to be done right now. So that's what we call a hatra'at in doubt, because it's not clear I'm actually going to transgress it, because I'm not done with the action at that moment. Like murder, I finish it right away. But in this case, I don't finish it right away. I'll only finish it when I sprinkle the blood, and that's called a hatra'at safek. And you don't get a hatra'at safek lo shema hatra'at. You don't get a warning for that. Okay? So now we can understand why he says in the case. Now let's go back. Echa bifnim ve'echa bachutz, right? L'Rabbanan rishon kasher upatur. Okay, what we're going to do with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon sheni below taseh. Because now you have to combine two things. The first one was done bifnim, so it was done completely properly, and you had to sprinkle the blood, which makes the shechita valid, which makes otovet beno kick in. And then you did your otovet beno bachutz. Now, you're not going to get lashes for otovet beno because he says, right, it's a lo taseh, but you're not going to get lashes for it because the warning was a hatra'at, right, a hatra'at safek. But now go back to that line, kol reuya lavo la'achar zman hareu below taseh ve'en bo karet. But now, since this is now an animal that you weren't allowed to slaughter inside today, okay, even though you weren't going to get lashes for it, you weren't allowed to slaughter it inside today because of otovet beno, because there is otovet beno in kodashim if you sprinkle the blood of the first animal after you slaughtered it. It's now he has this unique opinion that when it comes to slaughtering this animal outside the temple, which you did in that case, you're going to be liable for chutz. You're not going to get karet, but you will get lashes for it. So you won't get lashes for the otovet beno, but you are going to get lashes for chutz, because now you took an animal that couldn't have been brought in the temple today, could have been brought tomorrow, and you slaughtered it today outside. That's going to get you lashes, just not karet. Okay? So that's how we find a case, and now we re Rav Hamnuna into saying that when Rav Hamnuna said there's no otovet beno by kodashim, what he meant is there's no lashes for otovet beno by kodashim because of the issue of hatra'at safek. But there could be cases of otovet beno where it's forbidden. It's just not, you're not going to get lashes. But once it's forbidden, it's mechusar zman, and once it's mechusar zman, you can have this problem of shechita. Okay. Va'az de Rava l'tameh. Rava goes l'shitato. Okay, this fits in with Rava's opinion in general, because Rava now in a different case is going to quote something that's going to fit with Rabbi Shimon's position and the way we just explained it. Okay, Da'amar Rava, hi chullin ubena shlamim. If you have an animal that's chullin, and then its offspring is shlamim, and shachat chullin, and first you slaughtered the chullin, which is total shechita reuya, and then you did the shlamim second. Okay, now, according to all of it, right, anyway, we understood Rabbi Shimon, the first one's completely valid slaughter because it's not kodashim, it's chullin. But the second one is shlamim. Now, what did he say? You're never going to be liable otovet beno on the second one, even though it's a prohibition of otovet beno because it's a hatra'at safek. And that's what he's going to say here. Achar kach shachat shlamim, you're going to be patur because you can't get lashes for that because it's only a hatra'at safek. Because again, when we warn you about the action of slaughtering, but you don't actually finish the prohibition until later when you sprinkle the blood, only then does the shechita be counted as a shechita, and by that point it's too far away from your warning, right? You could have said, oh, I forgot already about the warning. That's not a proper warning. The proper warning has to be right when you do the action, and this action isn't done till later. But shlamim, chullin chayav. But if first you did shlamim and you sprinkled the blood, then that would be called a valid shechita, even according to Rabbi Shimon. And then you did chullin, you'll be obligated. Va'amar Rava, and furthermore, Rava says, hi chullin ubena ola. Now, what if it's an ola? Now, an ola is a separate problem. An ola gets completely burned. Now, in an ola, we're going to say that to Rabbi Shimon, there will never be a shechita reuya, because what's a shechita reuya? It's one that permits something to be eaten. An ola can never be eaten. So there is no action that permits anything. Okay, well, we're going to see maybe there is, but right now they're going to assume not. Lo mebaya. So therefore, it doesn't matter the direction. There'll never be otov beno, because shechita chullin is never a valid shechita, because it doesn't permit anything to be eaten. So shachat chullin, v'acharkach shachat ola de patur. In other words, not only lo mebaya, I don't even need to tell you, obviously, if shachat chullin and then shachat ola, you're going to be patur. If right, in other words, both cases are going to be patur. Both if you slaughter the chullin first, that's not a valid shechita. So then if you slaughtered I said this wrong. Sorry, I got confused for a second which was which. You don't even need to say the case, obviously, when it's parallel to what we just said about shlamim. The first you did the chullin, the one that was the regular one, which is a valid shechita. Then you slaughtered the ola, you're going to be for sure patur, because that's a warning of safek, because nothing happens until you sprinkle the blood. For sure, until then, it's not a shechita that's valid. That's just like the shlamim case. Turning now to Amabet, ela afilu shachat ola, but even if you started with the ola, v'acharkach shachat chullin, you're going to be patur. Even if you started with the ola and then went to the chullin, you're going to be exempt. Why? Shechita kamaita lav shechita bat achilahi, as I said before, because the first shechita you did of the ola is not a shechita that permits anything to be eaten. If it doesn't permit anything to be eaten, then it's a shechita she'ena reuya, according to Shmuel. That's Rabbi Shimon. That's Rabbi Shimon's definition. However, kind of intimated this before, Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he disagrees. He says, what are you talking about? What happens in an ola? When you sprinkle the blood, what does it do? You slaughter the animal, then you sprinkle the blood. The sprinkling of the blood permits what? Doesn't permit the food to be eaten because everything has to be burned. It permits all the parts of the animal to be burned on the altar. Before you sprinkle the blood, you can't put them on the altar. So what's that called? Achilat mizbeach. If you remember anything about tzvachim, this is one of the main things, that something burned on the altar is considered eating of the altar. Okay, this came up in Pigul, as we're going to see in a minute. So achilat mizbeach shema achila. So this will be a valid slaughter, because in the end, the sprinkling of the blood, when you do it first, remember, when you do it second, it's a warning of safek. That's not going to work. But when you do it first and you sprinkle the blood, that already permits its consumption on the altar, which is considered like consumption by a human. Okay, da'amar kra, how do we get that? My time, da'amar kra. Im ha'achol ge achel, remember that double language, this is the famous Pigul pasuk, mi basar zevach shlamav, beyom shlishi lo yiratzem, akrivoto lo yichashev lo, that was all the machshava. Anyway, the point is, ha'achol ya'achel, what do you see here? B'shtei achilot ha'katuv medaber, achad achilat adam, ve'achad achilat mizbeach. And that's why Pigul applies by a thought about either I'm going to eat it beyond its designated time, or I'm going to burn it on the altar, because they're both considered achilot. Anyway, the point being that this case, this was just an extra case Rava brought, that kind of fit with his whole theory. Then in a Chullin case, according to Rava, you're actually never going to have, in an Ola case, you're never going to have shechita she'ena. It's always going to be a shechita she'ena reuya, whether it's the first one or the second one. But Rabbi Yaakov, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, disagrees with that and thinks, no, of course it's going to be a shechita reuya if it's the first one. If it's the second one, even if you sprinkle the blood in the end, it's a hatra'at safek, you're not going to get lashes for it. But if it's the first one, the ola, then it will kick in, because achila on the mizbeach is like achila of adam. And it is a valid slaughter once you do the slaughter with the sprinkling of the blood of first animal. Otov beno will kick in for the chullin animal. And there you'll have a definite warning, because chullin, as soon as you slaughter, that's the end game. Okay, with that, we finish that section. Now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. And here's the basic machloket Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis that we've been discussing. Here we see it finally in the Mishnah. Until then, it was the Gemara kind of quoting it, but here you see it head on. Hashochet v'nimtza treifa. If you slaughter an animal, but it turns out it was a treifa. This is a shechita she'ena reuya, because it's a shechita, but you won't be able to eat the animal. Hashochet lavodah zarah. You slaughter for idol worship. Hashochet parat chatat. You slaughtered for paraduma, where you're going to end up, in those cases, what happens? You don't eat the animal, you use it for the ashes. So it's also not meant for eating. V'shor haniskal, you have a shore that's forbidden to benefit from because it gored a person and it was convicted to death, but it hasn't been killed yet. That has, isur hana'an, you can't benefit at all, so it can't be eaten. Egg la rufa, which was also designated for an egg la rufa, and you slaughtered it, you're not allowed to eat it because it's forbidden to benefit. Rabbi Shimon poter. So in all these cases, Rabbi Shimon says, this is shechita she'eina reuya, it's not a shechita. So if you slaughtered that in the morning, you could slaughter its offspring later that day. V'chachamim mechayvim, the rabbis obligate you. They said, no, you can't slaughter their offspring. This is a shechita. Now, a shechita she'eina reuya, even though it's not a valid shechita, it's a shechita. This counts as slaughtering. What does shechita mean? You slaughter the animal. So what that you can't eat the animal? The rabbis think you still are obligated in otovet beno. However, they both agree in a case, hashochet v'nidnav la biyado. What if you slaughtered it and let's say there was drisa or chalada or all those different psulim that we saw, or akira, you pulled out the simanim. Okay, so if there was some sort of disqualification in the shechita where we can't even call this shechita, or hanocher v'hama'akel, or you slaughtered it or took out the simanim rather than slaughter them, patur mishum otovet beno. In those cases, we don't call that shechita. And remember, the pasuk says, don't tishchitu b'yom echad, don't slaughter them b'yom echad. So this is like you're off on a technicality. Okay, in the end, you didn't slaughter it, so you can kill both the animals in one day. You just can't slaughter them in one day. Okay, it's taking the pasuk very literally, and this everybody agrees with, because this is not a slaughter. But the disagreement is, what if you did actually do the act of slaughtering, it's not permitted to eat for some other reason. Okay, so that they have a machloket. Now, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rish Lakish says, Lo shanu ela sheshachat rishon la'avodah zarah, v'sheni l'shulchano. When the rabbis say that we're going to make you obligated, it's only when you're going to get lashes for otovet beno if you slaughter the first for idol worship and the second for your table. Okay, meaning it was a normal one. Then you're going to get lashes for the second one. Aval, but if it's the reverse order, see if you could start figuring out the problem. Rishon l'shulchano, v'sheni la'avodah zarah, patur. If the first one was for your table, and then you took the son, let's say, it doesn't matter the order, but let's say, usually they just, because the pasuk says, otovet beno, most of the cases are first the mother, then the offspring. So you take the second one for avodah zarah, you're exempt. Why are you exempt? Because if you slaughter an animal for avodah zarah, you're liable the death penalty. If you're liable the death penalty, there's a halachic principle that we learned a lot in Sanhedrin, but in other places as well. You're going to get the harsher punishment. Okay, today we're going to end our daf with a bit of a discussion about kimle b'derabamine. Okay, so now you have a punishment of death and a punishment of lashes. We're going to forego the lashes because of the harsh punishment of the death penalty. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan. Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, come on. What are you telling me? Every child knows this. Why are you telling me something that's so completely obvious? Of course you're not going to get lashes in that case. Nobody would have thought that. Why are you saying this as if it's your big chidush? Ella, what he says is, if you want to say something, this is what I would say. This is more of a chidush, of a more unique ruling that you would need me to tell you. Ella pa'amim. There are sometimes I could tell you cases where even though there's a principle of kimle won't kick in. Why? What would that case be? Let's say you were about to slaughter the second animal, and somebody says to you, "Do you know if you do this, you're going to get lashes for otovet beno because you already slaughtered. Someone slaughtered the mother this morning." But if they forgot to warn you, you're slaughtering an animal for avodah zarah, you're going to get the death penalty, then you won't get the death penalty, in which case the lashes will kick in. So says Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish doesn't agree with this. So this is a very important machloket. We actually saw it in Ketubot, but that was a long time ago, so you likely don't remember. But this is a big machloket because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Amar, Kevan dechi atru be patul, since if they had warned you for avodah zarah, you would have been exempt from the lashes here for otovet beno, ki lo atru be nami patur. Even if they didn't warn you, and you're not going to get the death penalty, you're still going to be exempt from otovet beno. That's a very radical statement. Because what he's saying, right, if you take kimle as a logical thing, right? Okay, we're not going to give someone two punishments, especially death and lashes, but even if it's two other punishments, we're not going to give you two punishments for one thing. But here you're not getting one punishment. And he's saying, well, since what he's basically saying is, as soon as you're doing something that gets you the death penalty, the lashes is overridden. So it's overridden no matter what, whether you get it or whether you don't get it. Okay. And that's a big radical statement, because now this person is going to get off scot-free when he actually did two terrible things, right? He should have gotten the death penalty if he had done it intentionally, right? Known about it, gotten warned, right? Who knows? Maybe he was intentional, he just wasn't warned, right? And who knows? So it's a very radical statement. Unclear whether he thinks there's a real logic to this or whether he thinks it's, again, like a technicality. Well, once it's kimle, that punishment is just ignored completely, whether the first one is there or not. The azdu l'tamayu, when they fit with their positions, and this is the sugya in Ketubot, the chi'ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he said, chayve mitot shogegin, v'chayve malkot shogegin. If you did something that you were liable to the death penalty, but you did it unwittingly, so you're not going to get the death penalty, or malkot, you were supposed to get lashes, but you did it unwittingly, so you're not going to get lashes. V'davar acher, if you did that with something that would have obligated you money, that's what most commentaries think davar acher is, and a monetary payment, Rabbi Yochanan omer chayav, Rabbi Yochanan says you have to pay the money because, again, says you're not obligated for the other one, so the lower one kicks in. Rish Lakish amar patur, and he says you're exempt. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav hatra'at, because they didn't warn you for the other thing. We know because it was shogeg. Otherwise, right, that's clear you didn't know, and therefore, since they didn't warn you, you're not obligated. So the lighter one kicks in. Rish Lakish amar patur. This is just review. To kevan dechi atrube patur kilo atrube nami patur. If they warn you, you be exempt. So even if they don't warn you, you're also exempt. V'tzricha. Now, why do we need to say that they argue in both these cases? Couldn't you have just learned one from the other? To which they answer, Diyash minam baha. Well, remember, one is death and lashes, and one is death or lashes against money. And now we're going to say, right, you would think maybe more likely, okay, we're going to see which one. Tzricha diyash minam baha. If you had just our Mishnah, where it was death penalty over lashes, you might say, Bahaka Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that you're going to be obligated the lashes. Why? Because lashes is in place of death, okay? That like lashes and death are kind of the same. And we're going to say, I'm Rish Lakish says you're exempt, because he's going to say these are both very similar. There's death and there's lashes, and lashes is like part of death. They're both on your body. So there he says, we're going to view this as one unit, and if once you don't get one, you're not going to get the other. But when it comes to money, Rabbi Yochanan, one has to do with your body and one has to do with money. Maybe he would say you have to pay the money though. The Itmar Bahan, this for the same logic, if you just had the money case, you would say Bahakam Rabbi Yochanan. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says, you have to pay the money. But when it comes to your body, so maybe he would agree when it's death and malko, where it's both on your body, maybe we would say that it's all kind of one unit, and once you're exempt from one, you're exempt from the other. And, or if you don't, since you would have been exempt, basically that exemption kicks in, and therefore you needed to have said it in both. Okay, with that, we'll stop our daf here because the next thing starts on another sugya. Okay, so let's just quickly review. We finished up with that one, you get lashes from Mechusar Zman, and we said, right, the second answer was Mechusar Zman doesn't actually have lashes associated with it, because this nitkola aseh, which means the Torah really switched it into an aseh. It's not really a negative, it's only a positive. The negative that comes from a positive. Then we had the statement of Rav Hamnuna, that Rabbi Shimon says that tov beno is not in kodashim at all. Rava basically brings this brighta that makes no sense. He tries to have it make sense. And he says this, this really, by the time he finishes explaining the brighta, it's clear that Rabbi Shimon holds there's a case of kodashim, right, where tov beno kicks in after the first shechita, right? The first shechita, if it's done validly, right, even though it's a shechita kodashim, which we thought, according to him, is never a valid shechita, if you did the shechita and you sprinkled the blood, it would be a valid shechita, and no tov beno would kick in. And then we had this one unique case, which was the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in that brighta, since it can't be brought today, the second one, and you did it outside, but since it could be brought tomorrow, you're going to end up in this in between where you're going to have shechut, prohibition, get lashes, but you won't get karet. It's like an in-between. But that was all based on this otovet beno. So in the end, we had to say that really otovet beno could kick in from the shechita of the first animal. It's just you'll never get punished for it and get lashes for otovet beno on the second, because that's a hatra'at safek. Did a lot about warnings today. Okay, and then we just had some other, after Rava said this and explained it this way, then Rava, we saw he said some other things in the name of Rabbi Shimon. He didn't say in the name of Rabbi Shimon, but it was clear it's Rabbi Shimon's approach about the second one, again, not being obligated, tovet beno, not getting punishment if the second one was a shlamim, if the second one was an ola. Then we said even the first one's an ola, and that there was a machloket about, because it's a chilat mizbeach like achilat adam. And then we went to the next Mishnah about all these cases where Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis disagree, where since it can't be eaten, so it's not a valid shechita, or it is a valid shechita according to the rabbis, and then the cases where they agree with. And then we got to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and basically he points out this issue of kimle, b'derabamine, which Rabbi Yochanan says that's only if you're actually getting punished for it. If you're not getting punished for it, there's no kimle, whereas Rish Lakish thinks there is. And we saw they have the machlok in another place, and we said, why do we need it in each case? And with that, we finished our daf. Wishing everyone a good day.